cirka nesten 3 der, som området som
Hvor vi er snart. Ja. Har de 4 på seg? Så vi kan egentlig gå på? Og begynner, og så når det er ferdig med det, så går jeg.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل أئنكم لتكفرون بالذي خلق الأرض في يومين وتجعلون له أندادا ذلك رب العالمين.
Fornekter dere virkelig ham som skapte jorden på 2 dager? Og likestiller dere noen med ham? Han er Herren over alle verdener.
وجعل فيها رواسي من فوقها وبارك فيها وقدر فيها أقواتها في 4 أيام سواء للسائلين.
Han brakte fram tunge fjell og satte dem på den, og la i den velsignelser og anordnet næring på den. Dette gjorde han ferdig på 4 dager til alle som søker på like fot.
ثم استوى إلى السماء وهي دخان فقال لها وللأرض ائتيا طوعا أو كرها قالتا أتينا طائعين.
Deretter vendte han seg mot det himmelske universet, mens det var røyk. Han sa til himmelsfærene og jorden, kom, godvillig eller motvillig. Begge sa, til stede er vi mer enn gjerne og med glede.
فقضاهن 7 سماوات في يومين وأوحى في كل سماء أمرها وزينا السماء الدنيا بمصابيح وحفظا ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم.
Så fullførte han dem på 2 dager og anbrakte i ethvert himmelsk univers dets system. Og vi prydet den nederste himmelen med lysbluss og gjorde den sikker. Dette er anordningen til den mektige, den allvitende.
Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Ukadim lakom majalat samtiden anil Koran. Eller på norsk, velkommen til lansering av samtidens koranummer. As we have guests from overseas, I will do this introductory speech in English. First, I'd like to thank Avesa Kid and Anders Danielsen Lie, whom you just heard reciting a glimpse, an excerpt of the Quran, chapter 41. Anders, as you know, is a Norwegian actor. Aves is a so-called Qari. That means somebody who recites the Quran beautifully, because the word Quran comes from the Arabic word, both for reading and for reciting. Now, why choose the Quran as topic for a journal which calls itself Samtiden, the contemporary? That's not an obvious choice. And yet, today, I feel the Quran is very much a relevant topic. The American president, as you know, has refused Muslims to enter his country. And in 2 days, it will be known whether Geert Wilders in the Netherlands will come to power or not, a man who has stated officially that if so happens, he will prohibit the Quran. A few months ago, I went to the movies. I saw a film called The Arrival, which some of you might have seen. It's about aliens coming to, they enter the orbit of the Earth with an unidentified flying object. And it's unknown whether their intentions are good or bad, whether they come in peace or not. And the task of the main character, the protagonist, who is a linguistic expert, is to decipher the language and try to interpret them. Because these creatures have the capacity of emanating, that is, sending out from their limbs a beautiful scripture in the air. And gradually, as she engages in a dialogue with them, she realizes that the scripture, the language, also contains a whole worldview, a different way of perceiving the world. Now, if there are any journalists out there, and I think there are, and you're going to quote me on comparing Muslims with aliens, that's not exactly my point. My point is rather this, that as long as we do not engage in a dialogue with the other, the Quran specifically, and Islam, will remain threatening, mysterious, weird, strange to us. So Samtiden is about the opposite. Engaging in a dialogue with the other, trying in forthcoming issues to write about topics like the Quran, which are decisive for our understanding of the world, but which have been, in my opinion, neglected. So the Islam debate is ongoing constantly, whereas this event, which bears the subtitle, "What is it we do not understand?" implies that there is a lot we do not understand, because many well-read people, and I include myself, I work with literature on a daily basis, are not that familiar with the Quran. To be honest with you, I'm in doubt whether it is correct of me to maintain this dichotomy of Muslims and non-Muslims. I use it for practical purposes myself. We do that in this issue. But indeed, as you know, there are many ways of being Muslims and many ways of being non-Muslims, whether you're Christians, atheists, or something else. So I ask myself, how long time will it take? How many generations of Muslims who have arrived in Norway before we can address each other simply as humans? As this evening is not only devoted to the Quran, but it's also, in fact, the launch of my first issue as the new editor of Samtiden, and I realize now I haven't even introduced myself. Hi, everybody. I can't really see you out there, it's because of the sharp light, but I'm really glad you're here. My name is Christian Kjellstrup, and I'd like to thank a few people who have been involved in this issue, the work with this issue. First and foremost, I'd like to thank my contributors. Some of you are here who have written articles and essays for this issue of Samtiden, which is not only about the Quran, but many articles deal with Quran and feminism, the Quran and jihad, even Quran and the environment. And my colleague Thomas, who you've seen there, the handsome guy over there, he's selling Samtiden for you during this event. Writing for journal and reading the articles is a quite exciting process, and I'd like to thank each and one of you who have contributed. Secondly, I'd like to thank my editorial board, which consists of Mina Adampour, Mohammed Abdi, Nora Campbell, Sille Risenes, and Mr. Marco Demian Vitanza. I'm really looking forward to cooperating with you on forthcoming issues. Thirdly, I'd like to thank all of you who showed up here. I'd like to engage in a dialogue with you as well. I hope we can stay in touch. And I'd like to have response and criticism in my new occupation. And I also have to thank my employers at Aschehoug Publishing House. Today, one cannot necessarily take for granted that a journal like Samtiden would even exist. There are some obstacles to that, but I'm really glad that you have faith in me, a man who every day, in order to enter his office, needs, almost literally speaking, a machete to try to cut himself into the jungle, which is my office, that you have trusted me to carry on this quite long tradition. Samtiden was established in 1890, and some of my predecessors and editors are people I really admire and respect. So thank you, Aschehoug, for that. Last but not least, I'd like to thank my designers. As a new editor, I, of course, wanted a new design for Samtiden, and I'm really happy with the result. And after a long process, I eventually got in touch with Kord Design, and Jørgen and Cecilia at Kord, together with the illustrator Maria, have helped me a lot. And you know, being an editor can be a lonely process. And I made sure these designers have not been lonely for the last weeks, because I call them in the morning, I've sent them emails in the middle of the night and pushed them really hard. And Cecilia, who I assume is out there somewhere, has even been on maternity leave while designing Samtiden. She's been breastfeeding while we printed Samtiden. So her adorable 8 or 9 month old son, Mattis, who is now the mascot of Samtiden, has been present on some of our meetings, and he is the most patient guy I ever met. So actually I have a small present for him because it's important for me to reach out to future generations of Samtiden readers. So as some of you might see from here, this is for Mattis. Now we're getting closer to what I assume you're all here for, the conversation which Åsne Seierstad will lead with my 3 international guests. And again, my assumption that there's something about the Quran, whether you're Muslim or not, non-Muslim or not, that we do not understand, led me to contact people who do understand at least far more than the majority of us in this room. I invited 3 guests from overseas, and I'm intensely happy that they are here. The first of the 3 guests I contacted was John Esposito at the University of Georgetown in Washington. John, we have been emailing for I don't know how long, and you've been really patient with me. This event was supposed to take place in February, and it was postponed. We had agreed everything, and you still agreed to come now. He's very efficient, though, in his emails. His emails are like small haikus. He wrote, okay, great, fine, thank you. But we have hundreds of emails like that. And John is one of the greatest authorities on political Islam in the world today, I dare to say. He's written extensively on Islam, including books like The Future of Islam, The Threat of Islam, A Myth or a Reality, etc. He's also the editor of Oxford Dictionary on Islam. And today he delivered quite a lecture at the university, because simultaneously with this launch, for something it's really important to reach out to students. So we had today and tomorrow lectures as a result of a cooperation between university and Samtiden. My second guest, Karen Armstrong from the UK, is somebody I have admired, I suppose, since I was a student and came across The History of God, the international bestseller, in the mid-90s. She has won the TED Prize in 2008 for her continuous work with interreligious dialogue. I'm really happy that you're here, Karen. And the third guest was supposed to be Sheikh Mohammed Al Yaqoubi, and for private and family reasons, he had to cancel only a few days ago. And so we contacted Joseph Lombard, professor at the American University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates, who on such a short notice came to Norway. And interestingly, Joseph is the co-editor and co-translator of the Study Quran, a relatively new translation of the Quran, which includes commentaries and interpretations of the Quran from both Sunnis and Shias. So, in a way, I would say the intention behind the Study Quran coincides with the intention behind this issue of Samtiden. So I'm very glad that you're here as well, Joseph. And to top it all, I really wanted the best of all interviews. I realize I sound like a certain American president now, but it's true. I mean, we have the best. Åsne Seierstad is a person in Norway who do not need an introduction. She's an institution. I was about to say you're like one of the buildings surrounding the square. Wasn't it Oscar Wilde who, I'm sorry, I've compared now Muslims with aliens and Åsne Seierstad with a public building. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said 20 years of romance makes a woman look like a ruin, and 20 years of marriage make it look like a public building. But that's not true. But Åsne was my number one choice, and that you're here with these 3 distinguished guests is such an honor and pleasure for me. So thank you very much. Before you enter the floor, I should give you some practical information. The conversation will last till around 8:30. And then my friend, DJ 99, Guttorm Andreasen, will enter the floor and play lounge music from Muslim countries for you. So please stay and celebrate if you wish. To repeat myself, Thomas will sell Samtiden down there somewhere when this is all over. Also, tomorrow, as a part of the launch and my attempt to really reach out with the Quran, I'm opening up here outside at Youngstorget the bookshop of the Quran, where I will be selling the Quran and Samtiden only. And the best thing is Gyldendal Publishing House is going to pay for it. No, they're not. But you're welcome to come tomorrow to buy the Quran outdoors as well. Also, if you do not want to do that around noon, you could alternatively go to the university where Joseph, one of my 3 guests, will deliver the last of 3 lectures at the university in the library there, which bears the title, The Quran, How Should It Be Read? A Muslim Perspective. I think that's about it. So I'm really happy you're all here. And please give a warm welcome to Karen Armstrong, John Esposito, Joseph Lombard, and Austin Seierstad. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian, for that introduction. I'm so honored to sit here with 3 of this world's most brilliant scholars on Islam and on the Quran. And I would like to start with the core subject of this evening. We heard it, we experienced it, we felt it. The Quran should also be felt, shouldn't it? And I would like to ask all of you, actually, what was your first experience with the Quran? I would like to start with Karen.
Well, my first experience of the Quran came in the 1980s when I was still recovering from a difficult religious experience, thought I wanted nothing to do with religion ever again. But I was working on a television program in Palestine, Israel. One night, I was driving round the West Bank with a bunch of Palestinian young men who were, they never went near the mosque, they weren't religious, they were drinking beer. But suddenly the Quran came on the car radio. Now, if I were riding around London with a group of beer-drinking young men, and the Bible came on the car radio, there would be jeers and shouts and turn it off. But these young men were suddenly transfixed. And they began trying to translate it for me. And saying, it means this, it means that, and so saying, no, it means more than that, because Arabic is a multivalent language. It has layers and layers of meaning. And the beauty of the language from the very first moment of Islam was what tended to inspire people to convert to the religion, more than a clear message. There's Omar, the second caliph, who was really violently opposed to Islam. And there's a story in the Sirah of the life of the Prophet that one night he went to the Kaaba in Mecca, and the Kaaba, that cube-shaped shrine, covered as it is then, as it is today, with a sort of damask covering. He saw the Prophet praying to himself, and he got behind the damask cover and inched his way forward until he was standing directly in front of the Prophet, but not seen by him, covered by the damask. symbolically it means he was nearly ready, but there was one barrier still. And then he said he heard the Quran, and he said, Islam entered into me, and I wept. Quran means recitation. We've just heard it recited. It's not meant to be read as Protestants read their Bible. With the invention of modern printing and universal literacy, which made it possible for people to read. You always, in the pre-modern world, in all traditions, you listen to scripture. And often, certainly in the Catholic tradition too, we sang it, often in a foreign language. And the music occupies a different part of the brain. That which is more intuitive, the right-hand part of the brain, which is more intuitive than the left hand, which is all about definitions. We need both. But to read it only with the left brain in an objective way is not the best way to approach it. So basically, I have been studying now Islam for nearly 30 years. And I've studied it, the Quran, but I've never read it because I can't read Arabic. I read it in translation. But I see what's happening, and I listen to the recitations, and it enters into you, I think, in that way. And I think when we approach other people's scriptures, it's no good judging it from the perspective of our Western-oriented modern identity. We need to see where people are coming from and see the sacredness of sound, or the pure sacrality of sound, the Word of God, which reverberates. And in many ways, the Quran occupies the place of Jesus in the Christian tradition. Jesus is the Word of God. And you can see that perhaps the Gospels, written long after Jesus, are like the Hadith, which are commenting on Jesus, but Jesus is the Word. When people take the Eucharist, they are taking the image, symbolically taking Jesus within them. And in the Quran, Islam enters into me. And I wept. You are inspired in that way. So that made me see, that early experience, that I couldn't approach the Quran from the vantage point of a Western-educated person. You needed to empty yourself of those preconceptions and open yourself to a different experience. And that's, I think, essential when we deal with all traditions in our globalized world.
Thank you. Joseph, you have read it and you have translated it. What was, and you're an American Muslim, you're a convert. What is your way into the heart of the Quran?
My way into the heart of the Quran. Oh, mashallah, that's
Sounds
difficult.
like the name of a good book.
Yeah, way to the heart of the Quran. All right, you can be my agent. All right. With the Quran, there are certain verses that Muslims read regularly that constitute parts of their daily prayers. There are certain surahs of the Quran that it's recommended that one read every day or every week. And those are the ones that with which most Muslims are very conversant, which happen to be very different than the ones that people from outside of Islam read today in the very politicized environment. So one thing that people will often find is that the verses that people read about in a political context or that people are citing in Islamophobic rhetoric are ones that a lot of Muslims hardly ever look at. Now, so for myself, in my devotional life, of course, I recite the Quran in my own prayers. And like most Muslims, I try to read segments of the Quran every day. And most Muslims, you'll find, have particular verses of the Quran with which they identify, or a particular surah with which they identify. For me, one of those is, it's a famous line in Surah Al-Hadid, the Surah of Iron, which is the 57th surah or chapter of the Quran. And it says, أَلَمْ يَعْنِ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَن تَخْشَعَ قُلُوبُهُمْ لِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَمَا أَنزَلَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ. Has not the time come for those who believe to soften their hearts to the remembrance of God and that which has descended from the real, from God? And it's very beautiful because it's kind of a challenge to the person reading the Quran to always deepen your understanding of it, to never settle, never say, okay, I understand what this means here, I understand what this means, but to continually open one's mind and one's heart to a deeper understanding of the Quran. And one of the things that I came to realize through a period of 10 years of sitting in a basement and working on almost nothing but the Quran, to the point where my wife claimed that she had become my second wife and the Quran had become my first wife, that the Quran is really ultimately, people will say it's about God, people will say it's about, the Quran is ultimately about you. The Quran is ultimately about the human being challenging and confronting themselves and what they are, and in a sense the kind of the lies that we might tell to ourselves about certain things. And ultimately the Quran has a deep down message, which is that there is a truth, and if you look within yourself, you know what that truth is. But you need to look within yourself. And that ultimately, by looking within yourself and challenging yourself more and more, you will find that.
Thank you. John Esposito, you are one of this world's most renowned scholars on Islam, but what is your introduction to this religion and to the book, the Quran?
My introduction is quite different than many people's, a little bit similar to Karen's. I was a Capuchin Franciscan, and with the Capuchin Franciscans for about 10 years, from the age of 14 to 24. It's the way an Italian mother makes sure that her son will be celibate and ready for marriage. But in any case, my mother would really, right now, hit me off the side of the head for saying that. I was a young Vatican II theologian, and I decided to do a PhD. I was going to do it in Catholic studies, and we were required to do a degree in world religions. You major in one, minor in two. I was going to do Catholic studies, and I never took a course in it because I became infatuated with Hinduism and Buddhism, and I went to the chairman of the department and said, I can do a doctorate in Hinduism. I was very pragmatic. My professor was a wonderful professor from India. I had written a term paper. I hadn't thought about doing that as a dissertation at all. He said, this is really good. You could do a dissertation. I ran to the chairman. The chairman said, that's great, but I think you ought to take a course in Islam. We went back and forth on 2 or 3 occasions, and I was very resistant. Knew nothing about Islam, was in my early 30s and married and wanted to get on with my degree. I finally agreed to do it because I could see the chairman could be an obstacle to my getting my degree. And we had just hired a Muslim professor, and I went to him and said, I want to take a course. And he said, well, you need to study Arabic. I said, why? He said, because you want to do your degree in Islam. I said, no, I made it clear I'm not going to do a degree in Islam. I'm only going to do one course. And what actually happened was that in the course on Islam, the unique thing about it was, unlike most American universities, in our class, almost everybody was a Muslim. And this was like the late 60s, early 70s. But that's because he got scholarship money to fly in people from all over the Muslim world. There were only maybe 3 or 4 of us who were non-Muslims. So I was engaging the Quran, but I was actually engaging the Quran as I was the Hadith, the traditions about the Prophet, through my classmates. It wasn't as if I initially on my own opened the Quran. It was rather that the introduction came in many ways from the way in which they spoke about the Quran. And I want to reinforce just one point that Karen made about listening to the Quran and its ability to move people. At one point, many years ago, when I was teaching at Holy Cross, before I went to Georgetown, we had an ROTC, military guy on campus, and he was really gung-ho, major, seen as a kind of, this is being live streamed, right? Oh, well. So he was kind of a kick-ass person. And he came to my office one day, and we just started talking, and he's born American, 2 MAs, and he suddenly told me he was a Muslim. This has been like 1973, you know. So I was surprised, and we got talking. I said, well, how did that happen? He was stationed in Thailand, which is a Buddhist country, walking down an alleyway, and there are also Muslims in Thailand, and he heard this chanting, and they were chanting the Quran. He went into the mosque, and he was so moved by the experience that it touched him, that he was able to, it brought him forward. Parenthetically, I would say that that's the way some people respond, for example, to Gregorian chant. If it's done in the right context, etc., it goes right to you. That's the way I've seen it unfold among Muslims. I've spent a lot of time in Muslim communities in America and Europe, particularly around the world. And what really strikes you is, for example, there are lots of Muslims who are reciting the Quran and they don't understand Arabic, okay? But the way in which the Quran touches them, and then of course they read it also in translation, but the way in which the recitation of it can just go right through you is rather, rather phenomenal. At least for me, it's rather phenomenal.
Joseph Lombard, you have you're a co-editor on a book called To Study Quran, 2,000 pages. Can you tell us a little bit about the structure? What is lost in translation? How should I would guess most of the audience are non-Muslims. Is this a book that is relevant for non-Muslims that are not thinking of converting?
Well, the Quran says that it is for all of mankind. And it says regarding the Prophet, peace be upon him, it says, Inna arsalnaka rahmatan lil alameen. Verily, we have sent you as a mercy unto the worlds. Not just to the believers, but unto the worlds, unto all human beings. And so yes, definitely, the Quran has something for everyone. The Quran is very clearly a universal message. And the Quran is actually a message that also claims to be musaddiqan lima bayna yadayh. That is, that it confirms that which has come before it. It confirms the previous scriptures. And even the Quran, Christian was mentioning that there's an article on the Quran and the environment in addition, which is actually a very important thing, because the Quran, actually it's one of the things that stands out about the Quran among world scriptures is the degree to which it speaks about nature. There's one scholar, I believe it was Martin Lings, he said that the Quran claims that it is the last revelation. As such, it has a space for every other revelation to speak through it, including the first revelation, the world of nature. And then it also has many things that are, when you look at the great wisdom traditions in the world that we often go to, if you were to look at some of the things that we don't get given to us as part of those wisdom traditions, we would find that they're alien to us. The Quran is like this. The Quran has many passages within it that we can take as wisdom for human beings in any circumstance. And then it has other passages that we would say have to do more with the particular period in which it was revealed and transmitted. But it definitely has something for everyone. And even today, you'll find many things. Muslims will speak about this over and over again, how they find a passage and they look on it and they reflect upon it in their current situation, and they find that it applies to things that they are confronting today. One common one that Muslims will often cite in this context is a verse that says that God does not change what is within a people until they change what is within themselves.
The Quran is more than a book. It's an entity that spurs so much emotions. Today you have Geert Wilders in the Netherlands who wants to ban the Quran with the support of certain senators in the United States. You have pastors in the US who burn the Quran. And on the other side, I was in Libya. I was working in a school there, and a teacher gave me a Quran. The next thing that happens is a girl running up to me, taking the Quran. You're not allowed to touch it because you're a non-Muslim. She went to the mom. This was the big thing of that school for weeks. Whether or not I was allowed to have the Quran, it ended at the headmaster's desk. Karen, what is this, all the emotions on both sides about, it's just a text, isn't it? What is all the drama about?
I'm at the moment writing a book about scripture in all religious traditions. And it's something about human nature. It's a strange thing that we do. We take an archaic text and make it speak to our own situation. And all these texts, they deal with deep emotions. One of them is violence. Violence is a terrible fact of human life. We are a very, very violent species, and as we see. And because you're dealing with the ultimate, all scriptures have to wrestle with this, but also with our mortality, with the environment. You see, I mean, the very early scriptures, the Chinese and the Indian, are all also deeply concerned with the environment, with the importance of aligning with the world that we see it. We are creatures that have to live, unlike other animals, as far as we know, with the knowledge of our own mortality. We have brains that make us ask why. Why? What is the point of our lives? And if we don't find some meaning in our lives, which we have to work hard to do, we fall very easily into despair. And scripture has been one of those ways in which people wrestle with these deep and complex issues about how do we live together in society. When societies, all of them, the Koran preeminently in a way, preaches the importance of equality and justice. This is an ideal that is enshrined in our heads, but we never achieve it in our societies, ever. We've never managed it, but still it troubles us. These troubling questions, which can make us very easily lapse into despair, it's not just the Quran. We work it out with our scriptures. And since the Protestant Reformation changed the way we read scripture, because it coincided with the invention of printing and the gradual establishment of near universal literacy, which was finally achieved in the 18th century. Before that, people listened. Now they're reading. But the Quran, the Protestants said, no, only scripture. And go back to the original, go back to the early church. Where scripture, if you look at it, it's a work in progress. People take this text and they work on it with commentaries and prayer to make it speak to the conditions of their own time. And that in every single tradition. It's been an ongoing, you can see each tradition as a dialogue between an ultimate reality called God or Brahman or Tao or Nirvana, and harsh facts on the ground which are constantly changing. And the creative effort is to make those scriptures speak eloquently to one's own time. And of course this raises huge emotions because it's our very selves, our mortality, our inability to recognize or to realize the ideals that we believe in passionately, but we fail so constantly in, and the sorrows and injustice and inequity that we see that trouble us so much.
I think one of the problems that many, I'll just speak in terms of Westerners in this context, in Europe and America have, is that they don't engage the Quran, and then when they do engage it, it's because either a Muslim extremist is quoting it, or somebody who has somebody Islamophobic is quoting passages out of its context. So, for example, they will read a passage that has to do with the early period when Muhammad and his followers were being in contestation with the Meccans, and it talks about their attempting to kill you or to harm you. So slay the unbelievers wherever you find them. Okay, when you see a couple of those passages, they're cited to you, and more often than not, they don't cite what comes later in the passage, which is always, but you desist from it when they stop being a problem. Okay, if you quote it out of context, it's a big issue. Okay. But just think about this in a comparative sense. When was the last time you heard anybody talk about the vast number of passages in the Old Testament that deal with violence? When was the last time you heard somebody mention that in the Old Testament, as far as I know, it's the only primary religious text of any major religion where you have God calling for genocide. And that's part of my tradition, But we don't see people bringing that up in kind of modern society, even when people go to criticize. And my final comment came from a good friend of mine who's a Muslim leader, Sayyid Ahmad Saeed. This particular Muslim has a son named Isa, Jesus, and a son named Moses. Moses and Jesus are very common names, as is Mary. Mary is treated more in the Quran than she is in the New Testament. But he has a great sense of humor, so he was both wounded by the way in which people were making comments about the Quran, but then he sort of laughed and said, but the problem I have is I can't do it in spades back at them, because I'd have to say peace and blessings be upon Jesus rather than making it into an issue. So a lot of our problems at times has to do with contextualization. And unless you read a text, this is true for any text, let alone a sacred text, unless you read it in the context in which it was given. And what it means then is that there are two types that often hijack it today. The terrorists take that passage, they take it out of the historical context and basically say, anybody who's not my kind of Muslim, this passage is legitimating it. Some of the far-right evangelicals and Baptists and the Franklin Grahams of the world, they take it out of context and use it to their advantage. I never hear Franklin Graham, I've never heard him deal with the violent text in the Old Testament. And he could do that effectively, In other words, if in fact the Quran is so strange, why doesn't he say, in contrast to our scriptures? And just one thing for those of you that are Christian, remember that in your Bible, you also have the Hebrew Bible. So don't give the usual response, which is, Jesus said turn the other cheek.
And after all, there's quite a lot of violence in the New Testament too, in the book of Revelation. And it has to be there because violence is part of our reality. Interestingly, the word jihad and its derivatives, which we now think is sort of virtually universal, the most important word in the Quran, it occurs only 47 times in the Quran. And in only 10 of those instances does it apply specifically to warfare. The word jihad means struggle or effort. And sometimes it's a struggle to give food or money to somebody when you have very little yourself, but because they are worse off. Similarly, many of these passages that use the word jihad, especially in the early period when the Muslims were being persecuted in Mecca, he says you have to struggle to have sabra, patience, to endure without retaliating. This is a struggle for you because the Arabs were quite vociferous people, and it was hard for them not to sort of just retaliate. No, you must hold yourself and respond with sabra. The people of God, says the Quran at this point, walk gently on the earth. And when the aggressive people say to them, speak to them in vile ways, they answer salam, peace. That's a struggle. And so so warfare, certainly it's there because the prophet, unlike Jesus, was head of state. Jesus could wander around Palestine and be in opposition. And we all know from our own politicians, it's much easier to be in opposition than when you actually hold the reins of government. And every state, however peaceable and it says it is, it has to fight. It has no state, however benign it says, can disband its army. It's founded on force. And this is one of the things that we have to grapple with. And as soon as the Prophet became head of state, a little mini-state in Medina, he had to fight the Meccans who were threatening to exterminate the Muslim community. And it was a struggle to the death. But this is the tragedy of the human predicament. Again, a struggle constantly. We dream of peace, and we struggle perpetually against our own instincts. But that is what jihad is, not zooming off to bomb buildings full of civilians.
John, you mentioned slaying them wherever you find them, the worst of the sword, and about bombing buildings. We have our own very painful experience here in Norway with a right-wing extremist, Anders Behring Breivik, who killed 77 people. He used the worst of the sword extensively over, several, in a chapter about why we have to kill all Muslims because they are after us. These different interpretations, whether it's from the far-right extremists or different Muslims, can you tell us something about how has this developed over time? Where are we today? And the term of Salafism, of which explain that, the more purist or Puritan way of Islam why is that on the rise today? And yes, could you explain us a little bit out where we are at the different polarized interpretations?
I have a suggestion, which is that I'll deal with the sword verse, and then I'll turn it back over to John more for Salafism, because that's more his area of expertise.
It's good you have planned in advance.
All right. So when it comes to the sword verse, this is verse 9:5 of the Quran, Surah At-Tawbah, which is one of the later surahs of the Quran, and deals extensively with the situations that the rising Muslim community faced with other tribes who were opposed to them. Now, verse 9:5 says, "Kill the disbelievers wheresoever you find them." On the face of this looks pretty bad, all right? But then the next verse actually says, and if they desist and turn, that is in repentance, then give them glad tidings. And this sort of kind of goes on with a back and forth like this in several verses. But one of the things that becomes very important when you look at any verse of the Quran is something that's called the Asbab al-Nuzul, or the occasions of revelation. This is an interpretive tool whereby Muslim scholars knew from the very beginning that all texts have contexts. And you can't take every single verse of the Quran and apply it as if it were universal. And they say that some verses of the Quran apply only to the person about whom they were revealed. Other verses of the Quran use that person as an example of a broader principle. Some verses of the Quran apply only to the particular historical circumstance that they are addressing. Some apply to that historical circumstance and analogous circumstances. The sword verse, verse 9:5, is agreed by most scholars of the Quran to fall into this category, where it applies to something that did indeed happen, and it can then be applied to analogous circumstances. The situation was that there was a tribe that had declared open warfare on the Muslims. As if they came upon a Muslim caravan anywhere, it was all-out warfare. Their blood was legal no matter what. And so the sword verse says that it is a response to that when you come upon these particular individuals, they are going to give no quarter, so do not give any quarter. And in this situation, scholars have said, there's one of the most famous scholars of the Quran, Qadi Abu Bakr ibn Arabi. He gives the opinion in his book called the Ahkam al-Quran, that is the edicts of the Quran. He says, so this verse means that when you have a party that is opposing you in the manner that this group was opposing the Muslims at the time, that you may immediately engage in warfare when you come upon them. And then he says, this is the only types of circumstances in which it applies. And that opinion that Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi cites in his Ahkam al-Quran is then repeated in dozens of commentaries on the Quran after this. Now, in the current circumstances that we have, you will actually find people who want to take it completely out of that particular context. And they're not even being really literalists. They're being extremists that are trying to take that and try to apply it to a circumstance so that it will give them an excuse to be able to do this, just as people used to cite the Bible to say that it excuses and permits and even demands slavery, something which the vast majority of us denounce. In the same way, the vast majority of Muslims would denounce that verses such as this give license to wanton violence.
In terms of the term Salafi, it's very interesting that Salafi referred to the early generation of Muslims, the forefathers. And indeed, in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was what is often referred to as an Islamic modernist movement or an Islamic reform movement, in which these folks, Muhammad Abdu was one of the main names, identified themselves as a Salafi group. Okay? But the kind of Salafi that you see today, or in recent years and decades, are people who take the term Salafi. For them, they would claim that they are going back to the time of the Prophet himself. Now, just one final point on Salafi, which is deceptive. A little knowledge can be dangerous. There are different kinds of Salafi. There are people who are Salafi, and they're simply ultra-traditionalists. They don't engage in violence. They don't believe in violence. Okay? And then there are people who claim that they are practicing pristine Islam, but engage in and advocate violence. So there are multiple interpretations. The easy thing is to just give one interpretation to it, just as we do when we deal with a term like Wahhabi. But in fact, it means different things. And one of my students who's from Kuwait, I said to her, well, how do you feel about the Salafis in Kuwait? What do you think about their Islam? She said, oh, you mean no Islam? In other words, it's a religious attitude in which rather than, it just says, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. You can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. So it all depends when you see the term Salafi, because it makes it difficult if you are a Salafi who's not political, who's not into violence, and you meet somebody here in Norway or someplace else, and they say, well, how would you characterize yourself? And you say, I'm a Salafi. You won't get into the U.S. But anyway, go ahead.
I think we've seen a lot of extremism in most religions, religious traditions. I did a book on fundamentalism. It's a much misused term. It was coined by Americans to describe their particular version of it, because they were going back to the fundamentals of their faith. It is not really accurate to apply it to others. What I found in both these defensive movements that have grown up in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all rooted in a profound fear that every single one of them, be it Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, begins with what is perceived to be an assault from the secular or liberal establishment. And they're convinced that somehow this secular world wants to wipe them out. And this is not paranoia. If you think that what we call Jewish fundamentalism began after the Holocaust, when Hitler had tried to exterminate the European Jewry. And in some parts of the Muslim world, secularism, which is something that we grew ourselves organically here, and it developed under its own steam, was imposed far too rapidly and often cruelly. The Shahs used to make their soldiers go out with their bayonets, ripping off the women's veils in the streets, because these countries wanted their people to look modern, never mind whether they understood the new ideology, but they wanted them out of all this archaic gear. And on one occasion, Shah Reza Pahlavi in 1935 ordered the police to fire at unarmed demonstrators in Mashhad, one of the holiest shrines in Iran, who were peacefully protesting against obligatory Western dress. And hundreds of Iranians were killed that day. And this kind of sense that they are, of fear, similarly, some elements of the Muslim Brotherhood became radicalized when Nasser slung them all in jail, often without trial in 1957, for doing little more than handing out leaflets or attending a meeting. And in these awful secular jails, some of them became radicalized, but not all. And now we've tarred the Muslim Brotherhood, as John is always pointing out, with this radical group. But so, and this, you can see it the same in the Christian world, though the violence was not as serious. So we have to, when we think about benign secularism, we may have experienced it as benign, but it has not been experienced as a benign force, and it has pushed many people into a distorted vision, because when Sayyid Qutb, who entered that camp in Egypt, horrible prison in Egypt, as a moderate, surrounded by that horror, surrounded by that violence and terror, your vision becomes distorted, and out comes a different version. So when we're talking about it's good to secularize, I think it is good for us to secularize. It's been productive for us, but the way it has been experienced in some parts of the world has been counterproductive.
But for us, secularism is not necessarily seen as a threat to religion.
No.
Although for some secularists, they believe to be fully secular, you give up religion. And so in many Muslim countries, the sense when you use the word secularism, it's haram,
yes.
And the interesting thing about it is Erdogan of Turkey, right after the revolution, flew into Cairo. And at the same time, I was in Istanbul. And I was sitting at a table with the head of Ennahda, the Tunisian party, an Egyptian, very prominent Egyptian, and a number of Islamic scholars, but who were from the Arab world. And they were kind of chuckling at what happened to Erdogan. Erdogan went in and was seen as this great hero because he supported the downfall of the Shah, of Mubarak. But in his speech, okay, because in Turkey you had a rabid secularism, okay, which to be secular in the old days in terms of Turkish secularism was if you were religious and especially if you looked religious, you wouldn't get a job in the bureaucracy, you couldn't go to university if you were covered head, etc. When Erdogan came in, what they defined was a secularism that was like a Western secularism. In other words, it's a secularism that separates religion. Things have changed now in the last year or two from the state, but allows for people to be religious. So Erdogan is encouraging, and he uses the word, and it's like, follow the paradigm we have, become secular. So I'm at a dinner, and these guys are all kind of laughing, feeling sorry for him, because they're saying he just had no idea. And the crowd immediately became of course, celeb in terms of the media and whatnot. So I think that's the big thing, that idea of secularism, and having the whole question of how do you accommodate secularism. I would say the Turkish secularism is a bit like French secularism. It is not exactly user-friendly when it comes to religion. That is the old form of secularism.
Radicalization, as you both mentioned now, has many causes and many factors, and it could be a reaction to
Cruelty.
Cruelty, dominant leaders, secularism. But as today's theme is the Quran, in what way does the Quran play a role in the radicalization, whether it's violent or non-violent? The Salafis, like in Norway, like the foreign fighters who've gone to Syria, about all of them have been through important Salafi movements here before they left. So they would use or abuse the Quran as a rule book as something very concrete. Can you, and this is a question that many people ask themselves, what does this to do with Islam? What does this has to do with the Quran? If actually to all of you, as this is such an important topic for Europe and the rest of the world now with a radicalization of our youth.
Well, Karen's looking at me, so I'll take this tough question first, and then she'll probably do a better job with it than I do. But first of all, the Quran in and of itself, as itself, doesn't have anything. It doesn't do anything. People are, I think Karen put it very well when she said that when people are radicalized, it usually has to do with an element of fear. And a lot of times for the individual, that fear is that they feel that their particular identity is being threatened in some way, a sense of who they are. And so they cling on to this. And then sometimes it depends on what background they come from. They will find a text that other people say that this is a seminal text to our particular tradition, and then from that, take a few verses here that can then reinforce a particular ideology and a particular political ideology in this particular instance that you're talking about. So it's really not the Quran that is what brings about the process of the radicalization. It's a bunch of external factors, and then people take those verses and they use them. And somebody could just as easily, within a Christian environment or a Jewish environment, go and take Ezekiel 9:5, which is the verse that John was referring to that encourages genocide. You go take Ezekiel 9:5 and then say, well, this is really what the tradition is about, and somebody could be radicalized in that way. And studies have actually shown that when people, for example, go on the Hajj, that they come back with greater empathy. That when people are involved in religious themes, and can you say make the broader sense of the tradition, that it does have a tendency to take people away from violent inclinations and from violent interpretations of the religion. So I think it's very important that we distinguish between what role the actual religious texts are playing and what role the external factors that are causing people to bring these particular interpretations to the texts are bringing.
I just note that the Gallup organization, and I used to be associated with Gallup, they did surveys, particularly with regard to jihad. And what they found was that the people who okayed terrorism were people who cited political grievances, okay, and then would turn to religion. The people who were against, that kind of violent interpretation always cited, would always cite the Quran. Now, if you go back and look at bin Laden's first big interview on CNN, not that he thought it was a big interview, but it's the first big interview. You can get it off the text. What you will see is the first couple of pages are all about political grievances. Grievances with, and they're widespread grievances in the Arab Muslim world. Whether you're talking about Palestine and Israel, whether you're talking about the impact of colonialism. And then after a couple of pages of text, he then, now that he's ready to talk about we need to fight against it, that's when he then draws on Islam and pulls out, and frames what he's going to do, which shouldn't be surprising, in order to legitimate and to mobilize.
And what I got from I think it's your point about the different use of the texts after 9/11 in that Gallup poll. This should have been broadcast throughout the Western world. 93% of Muslims questioned in this massive poll, when asked, were the 9/11 attacks justified, said no and cited the Quran. The 7% only who cited the political reasons. This is a massive finding. And why is it not broadcast sufficiently? Now, about the Quran and modern violence, you must by this time have heard this story about two wannabe jihadis who left Birmingham in the UK a couple of years ago to go to Syria, who'd ordered from Amazon 2 books. One was Islam for Dummies, the other was the Quran for Dummies.
And these were Muslims.
And these were Muslims. There have been studies, forensic psychiatrists who are not liberal softies like me. Some of them, one of them has been a CIA officer, went into Guantanamo and interviewed all the 500 people there who were involved in the 9/11 plot. And he found...
Was that Sageman?
Yes,
Mark
Mark
Sageman.
Sageman. His good books, they're readily available. And he found that only 20% of them had had a regular Muslim upbringing. The others were either self-taught, like Islam for Dummies, or they were not observant until they encountered the movement, rather like some of the 9/11 participants, and also the Boston Marathon people. Or else they were new converts, like the 2 Nigerian converts who killed a British soldier in the street. He concluded that the problem is not Islam, but rather ignorance of Islam, and closer knowledge of Islam might have deterred them from these crimes. Now, these findings, again, are very important. And at this time, when feelings are running high, and we are seeing the result of with Trump, for example, and Brexit, of the dangers with which we are heading with these inaccurate ideas. And people say, well, why then does IS start off with, in the name of God, Allah, the benign and the merciful? And Tariq Ramadan pointed out, and I think quite rightly, on a panel we were on, this is a bit of defiance. The whole scorn, and maybe it's not so much in Norway, but I have to say in Britain, where religion is held in very low esteem. I mean, I have friends who ask me, please, not to mention my work when I go round to dinner. How can you make a living out of this discredited stuff? The sort of disdain of religion, or the disdain of Islam, it's up, here it is, a thrust of them. But IS itself, the core leadership, seems, as far as we know, to come from Saddam's disbanded army, which would have meant they were secular socialist Ba'athists, not devout Muslims. And IS is the horrible child of the British and American-led Iraq War. So we must remember, this is just their problem out there. And I mentioned this morning that when I started out on all this years ago in the 80s, when I was back listening to those Palestinians talking about the Koran, I went out to work on a film in Israel, Palestine, about St. Paul. But talking with Israelis and Palestinians, and I knew nothing about the conflict there, nothing about Islam, nothing much about Judaism at that point. The one thing they had in common, the Israelis and the Palestinians, was how awful the British had been. And this made me realize that's just not their problem. It's our problem too. Whether we're major players with colonialism in that region, or whether we've just simply backed along, tagging along, just not looking sufficiently into the past of the West and our interference with these countries, histories are intertwined. And we have to come to terms with our own past, with karma, in a sense, which sows bad seeds and creates bad things. And if you just dump all that on something called Islam, we are missing signs that we desperately need in our dangerously polarized world.
Look at Rabin, who assassinated the prime minister. You had a nice religious boy who was going to religious school, who had a real problem feeling Rabin was selling out Israel, poured over religious text until he could find a text that then legitimated his attempt to assassinate. Now, when that happened, almost nobody thought of brushstroking the religion. Or if you look at Christianity and its history of using, the Crusades, Pope Urban said, God wills it, again, it's this idea of contextualizing and looking at the individual or the individuals. Sageman and I were on the EC Commission on De-Radicalization. They kept changing the title. First it was radicalization, then it was de-radicalization. But one of the things that we found in many of the studies looking at the European situation was that it was an identity issue often driven by one's experience in a society of feeling marginalized, and of no value because of the way the media talked about your religion, because of the way people reacted, in terms of what you saw, the incidents of hate crimes, and also seeing the killing of Muslims overseas, the hundreds of thousands killed or injured in Iraq, and nobody talking, talking about that. And it's confirmed by Gallup data in which a majority of Muslims, when asked, do you hate the West, wind up saying we admire the technology, self-determination, freedoms, education, and we would want that for ourselves. But when asked, well, what don't you like? The denigration of Islam, our religion, and the denigration of Arabs and Muslims, i.e. Arab and Muslim blood is cheaper than other blood. And so I think it's that kind of, getting it. It doesn't excuse what people do, but unless we look at that phenomenon, then we'll be naive enough to think that if ISIS disappears, we won't see another terrorist group come up. People thought, with Al-Qaeda, you killed bin Laden, it's all over. The fact is, if the conditions in many of these countries are such, that they can radicalize some, most people, including most youth, accommodate, but others just feel, I've had it and I have to act out. And if, in fact, one sees outside governments propping up the government with money, with arms, etc., then you have this question of the near enemy and the far enemy.
The Islamic State is committing massive breaches of human rights in Syria and Iraq, but they also do it in the name of the Quran. And you mentioned the radicalized youth with identity issues or social issues being recruiting to this movement. Saudi Arabia is also committing massive abuses of human rights on a similar scale, but not so propagandized. Joseph, you have been criticized for having a too liberal interpretation of Islam. You live in the United Emirates. What is the response? What can be the response of, identity issues? Islam being of lesser, Muslims being of, lesser importance in the West and so on. What could be the response with the, holding up the Quran, but with different interpretation to attract young people to see, this is about peace, this is about my community, this is about living here, or how can you, what is a more peaceful, moderate way to attract those young people instead of them reading the same passages and interpreting them in the Islamic State or radical way?
Following traditional Islam. Really, this is what it is. If you go back and you look at history, there's a wonderful book called The Walking Koran. And the Walking Koran, he talks about the tradition in Africa in particular of memorizing the Quran. And you'd have even the women there would be people who knew everyone had memorized at least 2 full recitations. By the way, there are 10 different schools of recitation for the Quran. And just knowing that the depth that this book had in the classical tradition. One of the things that we tend to miss when we look at the politics, and we discuss this in terms of the politics, is we tend to think of those who denounce the West and this, that, and the other thing. Well, who's actually dying? Who's actually being killed? It's the representatives of traditional Islam. They are the first target. Before the bombing of 9/11, they killed Sheikh Massoud, who was the most powerful representative of traditional Islam in Afghanistan. Every single political Islamist group knows that their greatest threat is not the United States, is not Great Britain, is not a whole bunch of people in op-ed sections in Western newspapers writing against them. It is representatives of traditional Islam who have read the text and who interpret the text in ways that adhere to the great intricacies of any long, complex textual tradition. And so going back to that, that is the way, and it's already there. And what are the things that Muslims actually read? I'll tell you, they read Surah 36, Yasin, Surah 55, the title of which is The Merciful, Surah 56, Al-Waqiyah, the event, which is about preparing for the Day of Judgment, Surah 67, Al-Mulk, Surah 18, Al-Kahf, the cave, which actually, one of the central stories of it is actually a story of being non-violent in the face of living in a society of disbelievers. These are the things that people actually read. These are the things that Muslims, in a sense, that they kind of live by. Those are also the first parts of the Quran that all Muslims study when they go into the study of the Quran. And when you're studying the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, the very first hadith that you hear, and I've heard hadith scholars say this to me in Yemen, say this to me in Morocco, say this to me in Egypt. This is the very first hadith. Says within it, it says that those who are merciful unto others, God is merciful unto them. Be merciful unto those on earth, and God will be merciful unto you. And scholars emphasize, they say, the reason that you learn this one first is because this is axiomatic. It tells you how to interpret, act upon, and incorporate all of the other hadith within the tradition.
When George W. Bush was a president, one almost looks back to those days more positively. But anyway, when George W. I didn't say anything. When George W. Bush was president, I got a call from someone in one of the government agencies saying that a number of he and some colleagues, both in his agency and another agency, were interested would I come and talk, and also would I recommend names for other people, but it would be off-site, okay, so like unofficially off-site. And I said, so why are you doing this? And he said, well, you know, we're recent appointees, and we realize that we're making decisions all the time about Muslims in America and the Middle East, and we don't know anything about Islam and Muslims. So the first thing is, and it's gotten better, but policymakers need to know that. The second thing is, without co-opting, who should they be talking to? They should be talking to their citizens who are Muslims, working with those people, those families, those, you know, one of the things that we find is that everybody talks about combating violent extremism now, and yet nobody comes up with a good plan. Well, one of the good plans that some people are talking about is take a look, if you want, for example, in the US, in a number of instances where, in fact, there's a real relationship developed with Muslim families and Muslim communities, it's the imams or people in a mosque that come forward and say, we see a problem. Or it's the parents of somebody that come forward and say, we see a problem. And often there's an exclusion of that. Now, think about it right now. When you declare the kind of ban that we're talking about, potentially about, and when you declare on television, Islam hates us, not Muslim extremists hate us, okay? Now, if you're an American Muslim, how many of you are going to think, oh, well, you know, maybe I should reach out to government? Or how many of you, if somebody in the government called you up, you know, I mean, in terms of the current government, are going to think, wait a second, you know. So it's creating a climate that then enables you to deal with the issue. The easy, cheap answer, and I saw this in a talk I did on religion and violence at the UN and also at the EU, where in fact the people who were running the program said, as we developed the program, that there was a real debate within their agency, such as the UN. Significant number of people in the UN just say, religion's the problem, because it's an easy answer. You know, rather than the struggle of looking and saying, well, wait a second, religion is a factor, but what are the primary drivers?
This talk that we hear from the top leaders, whether it's Trump or Eastern European leaders, presidents that are totally anti-Muslim, you have experienced Brexit, you have the Trump, the polarization with the Democrats and the press. What kind of room of debate has been opened now? Insults, when that's spoken from leaders, do you feel that is spreading among, you know, getting into the more mainstream and also on the
Yes.
street level when it comes to
Yes.
being Muslim?
Since the Brexit vote, hate crimes in London have increased by 41%. That's a very, very sharp rise.
And in the U.S.
And it's the politicians, unscrupulous politicians, talking about the other and pure Great Britain, God help us, have given people license to do this. I fear very much we're only at the beginning. Because, and this, I think the West, sometimes I think this is the end of Western hegemony. If you look back, as I do, over eons of history, you see very often that when a great empire is coming to an end, certain things crop up. The economy starts getting out of control. Well, you know, certainly we're all in massive debt to China and others. 2, wars are undertaken that can't be won. And 3, you have this kind of xenophobia. Yes, what you do is you appoint terrible rulers like Nero and Caligula. And now other certain people have just stepped into their shoes.
Bless you.
And I think that we are at a very, very serious point in history. Because I have been in this, I was saying this morning, not because I'm filled with peace and love, but because I'm filled with dread at what could happen. The kind of rhetoric that we are hearing now was the kind of rhetoric used by the Nazis in the 1930s that enabled Hitler to do what he did in Germany, one of the most cultivated societies in Europe. And I think it's also a very, very worrying, this whole business of retreat, building walls against the other, sort of make Britain great again. This is, we cannot live without one another. We are living in a globalized world. We've created a global market which is so, our economies are so interdependent that when stocks fall in one part of the world, markets plummet all around the globe that day. What happens in the Middle East today can have political repercussions now in Britain tomorrow. And we all face the same environmental catastrophe. We're linked together on the World Wide Web. This retreat into these ethnic and it's a terrible form of irrational denial. We're not looking squarely at our situation. And this morning, I finished my talk at the university with a wonderful quotation from the Koran, which was which the Prophet himself spoke in his last farewell sermon. When he was bidding farewell to the Muslim community. O people, we have created you from a male and a female, and we have formed you into tribes and nations so that you may get to know one another. And this is the task of our time, to get to know one another, not to retreat into these ghettos telling stories about one another, but the hard process, which is a journey of unraveling some of our own preconceptions and chauvinisms and entering out to realize that whether we like it or not, we are in the same boat. And I very much fear that unless we manage to do this, the world is simply not going to be a viable place.
The Southern Poverty Law Center for several years, and in fact, one of its studies was cited by the FBI when it wound up about a year ago saying what the Southern Poverty Law Center has been saying for several years, that the first threat, that nobody's denying that there's a danger with Muslim extremists, that they're deadly, okay? But the primary threat in the United States are white anti-government groups. Some of them have a kind of Christian patina to them, but white anti-government groups. And Southern Poverty Law Center talks about how, in fact, the number has metastasized. When Obama was elected, and in the last year, with regard to the way our elections are going. The number of anti-Muslim sort of sites has tripled since election time. So what we need to do is put things in a context. one of the problems we have, and again, I want to be really clear about where I stand on terrorists, that okay, there's zero tolerance. But when you have conventional warfare, you're worried, but you're going to have big armies going against big armies, and then you're going to, so you're going to be worried about how large the army is, how large the plane is. When you have a situation that's not conventional warfare, where in fact two people can go in and take out a lot of people, on the one hand, you have to be really concerned because there's an extra sense of vulnerability. You know what I mean? The people can be there. It's not like they're coming at you with a plane. But you have to put it into proportion, okay? How many people have been killed by that, okay? And get that contextualized, because often when we talk about it, we're talking about a very small group of people. Even with ISIS has gone beyond our imagination in terms of what it's done. It's never had more than 30,000 followers. But how has it made itself, and how have they really terrorized Europe? When Europe recently, the French, etc., started going in, then they started coming in and they attacked Paris and they attacked Brussels. And there's symbolism there. Just as when the attacks in the US took place, it was the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. So to go into Paris because of some of the statements that the president of Paris had made, and the involvement of his Air Force, and to go into Brussels because it's the capital, again, the shock value, the terror value is there, but one doesn't want to blow that out of proportion because that's exactly what terrorists want. The whole idea of terrorism, any terrorism, by the way, Mark Sageman has a new book out that you'll really like because it's very thin. And if my mother were here, she'd say, but John only reads books that also have pictures in them. But the reality of it is that Mark has something out that kind of gets into the history of terrorism, but it's also in some of his earlier work, in which he basically says that, in effect, if we don't get it right, and if we overreact, and if we don't deal with what are the real drivers, we're never going to solve the problem. And he actually interviewed Guantanamo. Mark Sageman, by the way, is somebody with a PhD and then also a psychiatrist who was a senior person in the CIA, and then has done major consulting, including even recently with the UK and Guantanamo, interviewed lots of folks there. So you get a pretty good fix from him in terms of where he's coming down. Anyway.
You spoke from the UK perspective, the US perspective. I was just in the Midwest last week, and I spoke to a Muslim girl in hijab in North Dakota, saying now how it was to enter a bus, how she would listen to people saying, not directly to her, but we're gonna cleanse this country now. It's a scary feeling when talking to really young Americans. I will end with you, Joseph, you're an American Muslim. End with you, go back to the main theme, the Quran. How can this young girl be supported by the American Muslims community that you are a part of? It's also a very polarized. It's not a one-voice community. How can that community be helpful in this context?
I mean, because the entire community is one that feels very much under threat right now, and so it's very difficult. And history has shown that when you have situations where communities start to feel this type of internal pressure, that you do have different groups within the community turning in upon one another. And then you have people becoming informants for the community, and oftentimes the way in which they're doing that is to actually get vengeance for something that happened 15 years ago. And so the most important thing that the community can do is to not give in to those types of feelings, and to study what has happened with communities in this way in the past. And also, this is where I mentioned the term traditional Islam before. And many people who speak about this within the Jewish context, you'll find many scholars who speak about this, say that there's a fundamental difference between tradition and traditionalism. And that tradition is when you take the texts of the tradition and you try to apply these teachings to the exigencies, the contemporary situation, the exigencies of the moment, whereas traditionalism is to go back to how people read this text at such and such a time in such and such a way and try to mimic what they once did. And that's never going to work. And that, unfortunately, is the way that many communities sometimes seek to answer these types of situations. But to use tradition, where you're actually trying to live the texts, so trying to, as the tradition says, be that walking, living Quran. There's a famous prayer of the Prophet, which is probably a very good way to end, that you often hear in sermons. It says, Allahumma ij'al al-Qur'an rabi'a qulubina. That is, O God, make the Quran the spring of our hearts. Because it's thought that when you make it the actual spring of your hearts, that then your actions, that will condition everything through which you do, and it should be a process of the purification of the heart, and that through that, people can find answers from within themselves to the difficulties that confront them.
Karen and I came up with part of a solution. I think we were talking about it this morning. And that is that, I think if you look at the response to the ban when it was first announced, in the States, within hours, thousands of people went, okay? And the thousands of people were not all Muslims. Many of them were people who belonged to NGOs, human rights organizations, Black Lives Count. So when the situation gets really bad, and I think even if that were to occur in Europe, it will mobilize a sector of society that might not have been paying attention to a lot of this, but suddenly realize, wait a minute, this goes against the principles and values of my country, and the reason I'm concerned about it is, yeah, maybe I'm concerned about them, but it's also, if we change the principles and values, what does that mean for me? What does it mean if I allow this person who's the president or prime minister to do a whole set of things? Not only what would that do now, but with a precedent like that, what does it mean the next time we have an election and somebody suddenly says, well, there's a precedent for what I'm doing?
Thank you. We should have had your books here. We should have had a bookseller selling them. If we had laid them out here on the stage, they would have filled the stage. They can be bought online or through Tronsmo or ordered. These three guys are also on Twitter, so it depends what kind of message you're looking for. But thank you so much for telling us and enlighten us about this topic. And Samtiden, I thought I would also get into the themes of ecology and feminism, but was only time for jihad, sorry. But Samtiden, you should subscribe to it. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And before you leave the stage, I really want to thank you as well. You did exactly what I hoped for, that is contextualizing this very complex topic. And I agree with you, Åsne, this conversation is not over. And again, for that reason, try to find Thomas, who's down there, and buy something. And I repeat, tomorrow, I will be standing up there selling the Quran. And that is not about me being a Muslim, which I'm not, and I'm not a Christian. My personal opinion is really irrelevant. What I believe in, like you said, Karen, is getting to know each other, and particularly in today's political climate, I think that is important, to interact even with people whom I disagree with. I thought, oh, what could I possibly give you? You have given us so much. Well, of course, I had to give you the Quran in Norwegian. So, John? Does it have any pictures? No pictures for you. Karen and Joseph. And if it's not hot enough in the Emirates or Florida when you read it, you can tuck yourself into something called a Marius carpet, which is the most popular Norwegian knitted pattern, which you now have to drag back to all the way to where you came from as a Norwegian symbol. So thank you. And finally, as I assume I have seen a lot of pictures of you, Åsne, on the Facebook with wearing various traditional Norwegian sweaters and caps and so forth. You don't need that. I wanted to give you flowers, but you're all going back very soon. But Åsne, I'm really happy that you did such a brilliant, I was about to say jihad, effort to really tie this together. And just a fun fact, because tulips, as some of you might believe, come from the Netherlands, country much talked about these days, actually comes from Kazakhstan, a Muslim country. Just a little point there. So again, we have to wrap this up. I'd like to thank Kulturhuset for hosting this event. I also have to thank Fritt Ord for generously, that means financially, supporting this event. And again, for all of you contributing with your knowledge on this topic. And now, DJ 99, Guttorm Andreassen, will enter the stage. Please stay for those of you who want. Thank you very much.